So good evening, good afternoon. Thank you everybody for joining today's seminar, Sustainability Seminar Series. And as I have already introduced about the center, Sustainability Center at IIT Gandhinagar, I would not repeat the same again, but today we have a very, renowned speaker who is a science journalist, Disha Shetty, with us. And the idea about inviting her was like, what are different aspects of science communication when we talk about climate change in India or other places? So Disha has been actively writing about different climate change related issues, climate change, public health, and impacts of climate change. She has covered wide number of stories. She is, of course, an award-winning journalist, and she has worked in many different organizations, including Times Now. She has written in Forbes earlier, and currently, maybe 2 days back, she joined a new organization called the Fuller's Project, which is a non-profit organization, and that focuses on, again, the climate, the journalism, science journalism, or other aspects also. So Disha did, I think, masters from Columbia University. Disha, is that correct?
That's right. I
And
did.
she has been in the field for almost 10 years or slightly more than 10 years. And today, what she is going to discuss with all of us, some very unique case studies or unique aspects when we talk about climate change communication. Climate change has so many dimensions, but I think communication plays a big role because we have to connect with common people who may not know the science behind climate change, but then they are witnessing the implications of climate change in their day-to-day life, right? So how or what important role journalists play, I think that glimpse we would get from Disha's presentation. So Disha is, I mean, if you feel free, take your time. We normally have 45 to 50 minutes. And the audience, if you have questions, please, you can put in your either chat box or question and answer. And after the talk, we will have an opportunity to ask those questions directly to Disha. So Disha, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And it's our pleasure to have you today. And now you may start. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for having me. And I'm very excited to talk to all those attending today, especially because a huge gap I think that there's a lot of communication needed, interdisciplinary interaction needed between journalists, between scientists and researchers, because climate change is an issue that needs us to sort of work collaboratively, sorry. And there are some gaps that I have noticed as a science journalist. So over the next 30-40 minutes, what I will do is I will talk a little bit about what I have seen covering climate change in India, right? So as journalists, we are historians of our time in some ways. We bear witness to the things that happen. We document voices of common people. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I have seen over the years. So, as Sir mentioned, I've been a journalist for about 10 years. I have been consistently writing about climate change since 2018. And before that, I've written extensively about public health. So, a lot of my climate reporting also has elements of public health. And I'm going to take you through a presentation looking at what I have seen on the ground, B, what I think the missing links are in terms of research that would help somebody like me who's a journalist to tell certain stories better, and C, what are the different ways that we can, the scientific community and communicators and journalists can do to collaborate better, and how we can improve science communication, because we are the world's largest democracy, and ultimately electoral polls is also one way we can push our governments for climate action, and that happens via the people. But for them to be able to do that, as journalists, it's my community's responsibility to inform them about what is happening, and to so that they can make informed decisions. So I understand that scientific community has a way to push for change, but as journalists we work through the democratic process, and we're an important part of civil society. And given where we are here in terms of the climate crisis, we need all hands on the deck given the huge impact. So I'm going to take you through some of the impacts that and my journey, and then we can talk about any questions that you might have. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So, my name is Disha Shetty. I'm currently a reporter for Fuller Project, which is a US based nonprofit, and we cover women's stories across the world. And I'm going to be covering the intersection of climate and gender, as well as public health and gender. So, my journey of covering climate change started in 2018. So, in 2017-18, I'd gone to Columbia University for a mid career master's program called MA in Science, Environment, and Medicine Journalism. So, it was actually during that program when I was introduced to a lot of climate science. And US has a history of writing a lot about climate change. It also has a lot of climate denial, but it also has a robust science communication in its sort of universities are very hands-on on about science communication, as well as journalists write a lot about climate change. So it was then that I really started thinking about writing about climate change, because before that I was a public health reporter. Just when I wrapped up the program and I'd come back to India, I joined IndiaSpend for a 6-month long fellowship. Now, the idea of the fellowship was that I was going to travel around India and report on climate change. Now, when we started the program, and it was just me, so I was in 6 months, I traveled across 7 states in India. I trekked in the Himalayas. I went to Sundarbans. I went to Rajasthan. I went to Odisha. I went to Karnataka. So it was an exciting journalism experience for me, journalistically. But it was also extremely fascinating, all the things that it threw up. And in this presentation, I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about what I have learned since then, because that was the starting point. But since then, I've also had the opportunity to cover the UN General Assembly and this year's COP26 in Glasgow. And these are where the global climate conversation happens. So I'm going to talk to you also a little bit about where India stands in these global conversations, and what are the gaps there in my humble opinion, and what are the conversations that we ought to have but are not having as much. So, coming back to my reporting, what we wanted to do at India Spend, because India Spend is a data journalism initiative, we wanted to use data, scientific data that was already available, marry it with ground reporting. So, we wanted to understand what does climate change mean for regular Indians? What does it mean for a farmer, for somebody who's living in Sundarbans? How much of this impact can we see on the ground? Because by that time IPCC reports were well covered, but it was very abstract. So what does that mean for regular readers? What does that mean for you and I? And that's what we wanted to see. And I had myself read very little climate coverage from India, so I was also very excited. So we also hoped to explore the different kinds of climate impact. So, for instance, the reason I traveled to the Himalayan region was because we wanted to see how the melting of glaciers was having an impact. But the reason I traveled to Karnataka was to see coastal erosion. The reason I traveled to Sundarbans was to write about sea level rise. And so we wanted to look at like these different kinds of issues and different and the ways it was sort of affecting communities. So I went to Rajasthan to look at desertification. And so it was all about the lived experience of this data set that we were talking about, we knew about, but we didn't really understand it in tangible ways, right? So here are some of the places that I reported from. Himachal Pradesh, like I said, there I basically I'd gone on a trekking trip just before I started the fellowship, and I thought, okay, I'm already in the mountains, so why not talk to local people and see what they're saying. And I was surprised to find out that so here are the things that they were talking about. I was at an altitude of a few thousand, I think, meters. I was basically in Hamta Pass, and I was talking to villagers there, and they were talking about how apple orchards are moving at a higher altitude. So they're no longer growing at the altitude that they used to, because the temperature changes have happened. So what that means is these people who are reliant on apple cultivation, they couldn't cultivate the apples at the same altitude that the villages were. And at the altitudes that the apple cultivation was now possible was so harsh that villages, like, you couldn't move to those places, those altitudes. So that was, you were seeing a direct impact on people's livelihoods. Then they were talking about, in and I'll use Hindi here because I think that it sort of makes more sense. They would say, बर्फ पहले जैसे पड़ती थी अब वो नहीं पड़ती, हम जब छोटे थे तो इतनी बर्फ पड़ती थी, अब सिर्फ इतनी पड़ती है. So those are the ways that they spoke about climate change, and that was my job as a journalist to kind of translate it. In Rajasthan, I was hoping to look at desertification and what that does to people. And here, and I will sort of unpack this a little later on, but I looked at the impact on women's lives and what it was doing to a woman's ability to go to work, what it was doing, because women were spending a lot of time just filling water for their family as water became more scarce. Now, I understand also that a lot of this is a combination of climatic factors, but it's also a combination of social factors. And in some cases, you're not very sure how much of it is just climate change, how much of it is, local factors that have driven certain. If it's scarcity of water, then there could be some local factors that were leading to that. So it's a mixture of all of that. And which is why because my approach is very journalistic, it might not sort of, in terms of how scientists would approach it, would be very different, obviously. In Honavar, in coastal Karnataka, fishing communities and agriculture communities involved in agriculture, these are the two main communities that'll be hit hardest by climate change, right? So fishing communities, we're talking about the fish catch reducing, but also there's a lot of coastal erosion, and a lot of fishing villages are on the coast. So when the homes are going underwater, these are homes of particular communities, right? So we're also talking about caste based impact that we don't really see that reflected in our literature. So what broadly I found out was that climate change was a very perceivable impact. It wasn't any longer, because when I started the reporting, I thought, oh my God, like, how am I going to write about climate change? But when I actually started talking to people, and these were not city dwellers, I was going to small towns, I was going to villages. The impact was so stark, and it had happened like in a matter of a generation, that they could feel it. It was showing up in how their crop cultivation had reduced, how their fish catch had reduced. And everyone across, no matter what language they spoke, they knew of the term climate change. And that was very fascinating for me. And I thought that that's something that for me personally was very surprising, that to the extent that these impacts could be seen, and how easy it was for me to document that, because I thought it will be very challenging to see sea level rise. And I'm going to take you to some of those images of how stark they are actually. Um, so especially with respect to farming communities across the board, they knew about climate change, they felt the impacts, they lived the impacts, they knew the term. And these are the ways that they would say things like prithvi garam ho rahi hai, बारिश पहले जैसी होती थी अब नहीं होती. So they would talk about these things, which is essentially describing the changing climate, but obviously not in scientific terms. So my job was to hear what they were saying, and then to document that. So here are some of the lessons that I learned from my reporting, and the screenshot is from an essay I wrote for the Open Notebook, sort of where I documented my experience of reporting on climate change and my main learning lessons from that. So one of the things, because I'm a journalist in a developing country, I am very interested in, and I think it's my responsibility to talk and highlight local science, to highlight science done not just by Harvard and Columbia, but by Indian universities. And so when I'm reporting in India, I would obviously talk to, universities and researchers at IITs and IIMs, sorry, IISCs, but also, let's say, Nehu, for instance, if I'm in Northeast India. And that's something I make a conscious attempt to do that, to include a lot of diverse voices from my country. um, I also was surprised to find that, and again, this is to do with my limited knowledge because I had just finished a program at Columbia and I came, but I was surprised to find that there were so many scientists who were in India and contributing to the IPCC reports. And so many women researchers, and just there was a lot of local talent that as science journalists we have since intentionally tried to highlight. Um, the one of the things that I learned as a journalist very early on is that you have to listen to people and not underestimate what they bring to the table. So when I learned environment reporting from a professor long back, he told me that sometimes a garbage picker can tell you something about a plastic in a way that an engineer, a polymer engineer, might not be able to tell you. And what that means is, in terms of practical aspects of certain things, you have to learn to listen to people at the grassroots. You have to speak to people across different groups. Whether so if I'm talking to a farmer about climate change, I really have to listen to the farmer and understand that he or she already is experiencing climate change. And not all of that literature is in peer reviewed journal. So a lot of that lesson, that knowledge, is probably in the form of a community elder, is probably with a local NGO, it's probably with a social activist who's been studying an issue for 2 decades. And I might look up Google Scholar and might not find anything about climate and caste intersection, but when I'm on the field and I'm talking to community leaders and I'm talking to social activists, they'll be able to pinpoint exactly how this plays out. And I'll elaborate on what I mean when I went to the ground and found out how that plays out. But I learned the importance of just looking at gray literature, which is the literature that isn't peer reviewed and published, but also basically literature coming out of the community. I learned that it was very important to diversify my sources. So I tried. Often it would happen that most of my sources would be upper caste, middle aged men. Okay, so now we're not even talking about a gender, we're also talking about a particular caste group, we're also talking about particular age group. So I had to intentionally make an effort to quote scientists across age groups, across genders, across, because the perspectives were very different and it would show up in my stories. There were things that a woman researcher would tell me that a male researcher would not even think of. And even as my location as a woman journalist, there are things that I am able to write about when I'm writing about climate change that maybe a male a journalist might not feel comfortable asking about. For instance, periods and sanitation and maternal health. And again, these are things that I'll kind of unpack in a bit. So, broadly, I understood that the impact of climate change in communities was significant and it was very, very diverse. So, here are some of the major themes my reporting threw up. Migration was a factor that I saw because I traveled to 7 geographically different states, and in across the board, people were essentially migrating from their places to somewhere else. So, from Sundarbans, they would be migrating sometimes all the way to Bangalore or Kerala in search of work, or there would be migration in terms of rural to urban. But essentially, migration and displacement was a major theme. Second, impact on public health. which is very underreported, underdocumented, and that's something that I think I really want to harp on, and I hope to see more research on going forward. And the disproportionate impact on women. This it was just so infuriating and stunning, and I'll unpack that in the coming slides. So, migration. Now, firstly, this is a migration no one's keeping a track of. The migrants themselves don't consider themselves climate migrants. So how do I know that they're climate migrants? When I ask them, why did you move? They'll say, पहले खेती जैसे होती थी अब नहीं हो रही है. अच्छा आपकी पहले खेती कैसी होती थी, सो दे वुड टॉक, देन दैट्स हाउ दे वुड डिस्क्राइब दीज थिंग्स, ठीक है. देन इफ इट वाज इन सुंदरबन, सो दे विल से कि खारा पानी जो है हमारे खेत में आ जाता है तो अब चावल की फसल नहीं होती. सो दे टॉकिंग एसेंशियली ऑफ because of sea level rise, you're seeing salt water intrusion, and because of that their agriculture is collapsing, and because of that they're then moving out, they're migrating out. So they don't see themselves as climate migrants, and so the policymakers don't see themselves as climate migrants, but these are climate migrants. And it's important for us to use the right lens and to recognize this and to try and document this, because right now we're at a stage where we're not documenting anything, and then of course we're not responding to it because we're not documenting the distress at all. um, Now, what this does though is that globally, and because at the start I told you when I attend global conferences like COP and the UN conferences in general, there is a lot of push for recognition of loss and damage, right? So, developing countries like India say that because we've already had a lot of climate change impacts and we've already suffered loss and damage, the rich countries have to compensate us for it. Now, how will country like India make a case for loss and damage if we've not even documented loss and damage? So this lack of evidence really comes in the place, or sort of comes into the picture when India has to negotiate, or Bangladesh has to negotiate its position at the global scale, because most of the researchers are also of the global north. Most of the journalists are white journalists. They have no understanding of what a developing country looks like. They have no understanding of, or very very limited understanding of, how little carbon our population generates, like on a rural population generates. And India and China always blamed for using a lot of coal, right? So because we don't document a lot of this, it sort of has a fallout in weakening India's stand, or the stand of the developing countries in global negotiations. Now, a huge impact that goes underreported is on mental health. When families are moving, when entire communities are moving, these are children that are growing up without their fathers. These are, or they're probably going from one state to another. So the screenshot that I've put is actually, I first went to Sundarbans, and then I came back, and that time I was based in Bangalore, and I was writing this story of sea level rise in Sundarbans. And then I did some research in Bangalore, and I realized there are lots of Bengali speaking students in Kannada medium schools. So I went to these people. I tried to find these NGOs, and so these are kids whose parents are climate migrants. Um, so this is what it's sort of, the Sundarban Delta region and islands in Sundarban Delta region look like. This is Masuni Island. It's about 4.5 hours from Kolkata. They've tried to build embankments to stop sea level rise. Of course, it doesn't work. The picture on the extreme right is of a home. This is basically on the coast itself. And that man now works in Kerala for a few thousand rupees, and comes home for a few days in a year. And in his case, he's left his wife and child behind. And I caught him at a time when he'd come to visit his family. But in some other cases, the entire family moves. So you have a lot of displacement. Public health is another impact that to me leapt out a lot, simply because I have a background in reporting on public health. So some of the things that I came across was I was reporting in Bhadrak in Odisha, and right after that, I attended a journalism conference where I met a Bangladeshi journalist, and I was telling, and so Odisha is along the Bay of Bengal, and as is Bangladesh, and so I was talking to him about impact on women's health and what I'd seen in Bhadrak, and then he started talking to me about rise in miscarriages in Bangladesh and maternal deaths because of high water salinity. And then I looked up research on Google Scholar, and then I realized that Bangladesh had published some researchers in Bangladesh had published some studies about the links between communities that where their groundwater has turned more saline because of saltwater intrusion. They tend to have higher rates of hypertension, which translates into higher rates of miscarriages, higher rates of pregnancy complications, higher rates of maternal deaths, higher rates of infant mortality. Right, so we are talking about huge impacts that we and I. There is nothing that I could find from the Indian side on this. So a lot of health impacts that our women face doesn't show up in literature at all for some reason. Water scarcity and health impacts, very very simple, right? You have water scarcity. Who's filling the water? The bahu of the family is filling the water. What is she doing? She's trying to drink less water herself. It's leading to dehydration, firstly, for her body. Second, she's walking longer durations. You can think of knee impacts, joint aches, all of that. Then in there is some research in Nepal that looks at impact on women's reproductive health because of how much lugging around of water that they have to do as Himalayan springs are drying up because they are walking longer distances. Now, water scarcity is anyway a huge problem in rural India. So now, when this climate change makes it worse, then you can think of like all that the impact that happens. Air pollution, I understand that the link to climate is a little indirect here, because I understand that not every air pollutant leads to a warming impact, but a lot of air pollutants do lead to warming impact. A lot of air pollution pollutants also have impact on human health. Now we're beginning to see some documentation of that, of rising rates of lung cancer, rising rates of respiratory illnesses, and which is why we have so many people who move out of cities like Delhi. Now, that has happened, that movement of people has happened simply because we've now begun to document the impact of our toxic air on people. But still, I would say our understanding is limited, and our research is limited, or growing rather, it's growing. But I would say, like in terms of air pollution, now we really talk about it a lot more. So I don't know if the research came first and conversation came later, or the conversations driving more research, but I can see that happening, that change. I would say that I think there's a lot of need for doctors and researchers to collaborate on interdisciplinary research when it comes to climate, because a lot of climate is felt bodily, like climate impacts of climate change is felt. And we need to see more of this documentation so that journalists like me can write more about it. But in terms of seeing these impacts, it's very in your face. So this picture on the left is from Bhadrak, where these women basically uh, just spend the men have already migrated out because of saltwater intrusion. Crops are no longer growing. So the men are out, and women try to grow crops. They also fill water. They basically do everything, but they were not raised to do it. They were not trained to do it. So now they have to learn to do it in a patriarchal setup where they're not empowered. At the same time, they're responsible. So it's like a double whammy. The middle picture is a little like longer abstract connection. So her name is Libby Mandonka. She lives about 100 meters away from Goa's Marmugoa port. Marmugoa port gets a lot of coal imports. Now again, I'll go back to global conversation. Indian government globally makes a case for the need to hang on to coal because of our energy needs. And we also say that this is good for our communities, our population, right? Now, in Vasco, coal dust, because it's coming in through the port, it tends to fly everywhere. So these people talk about health impacts, higher rates of cancer in their community, but none of this is documented. Now, in the absence of documentation of what are the health impacts on communities that live around coal mines, that live around coal transport chains, we can never really, I mean, it's like saying that अच्छा evidence नहीं है, इसका मतलब है कि फर्क नहीं पड़ रहा है, and so coal is good. So there's like a lot of human element, because I went to report on this and anecdotal evidence was everywhere, but I there was no documentation of, yes, cancer rates are rising, or yes, this is the respiratory, this is the rate of respiratory infections or issues in this community. So in general, in my coverage of climate, less so in climate but more broadly in terms of environment journalism, the lack of evidence on impacts on local communities is a repetitive theme, and that really also gets in the way of these communities when they go to the court and they want to hold their governments to account, they want to hold their leaders to account. They can't, because there is no documentation. It's also interesting to note here that a lot of, and I know I'm talking at IIT Gandhinagar, which is also funded by the government. So it's tricky, because you in instances where the government is perpetrator, a government institute might, it's just like there are lots of conflict of interest. Final story is on air pollution. And the reason I put this picture here is because for this story, I had to actually use a global data set. This was a piece where the research was spoke about how a lot of sources of air pollution in Indo-Gangetic Plain were actually local. And it was a global study for which I looked at the data set for India. So, broadly, what I'm trying to say is that I have felt the need for more research on the public health impacts of changing climate or air pollution for me to be able to tell that story. Disproportionate impact on women is, of course, apart from filling water and that kind of bodily impact, you see a rise in child marriage, rise in trafficking of women because of climate change, because these communities are too poor to take care of their people in general. Feminization of agriculture is another impact. Um, Rise in extreme weather events hit women hardest simply because it affects women's sanitation, it affects maternal health for sure. I mean, generally, there's a lot of health impacts and mental health impacts, and a lot of it doesn't sort of get written about, spoken about as much. Also, it helps for me because I'm a woman. I'm able to talk to other women, but like even then men will get in the way, and they will sort of, as heads of family, want to talk about what their communities are experiencing, and even there the women's voices, you have to work harder to hear women at all. So this the picture on the left is this woman. I met her in a slum in Bangalore. She, when I started talking to her, she spoke to me about how she's actually a Bangladeshi immigrant, and she was married off as a teenager because her father's home, where the village was, would flood a lot, and they had very little to eat. So she was married off much earlier because of the reason I obviously didn't use her identity is because I care about her safety and I didn't want to get her into trouble. But we're talking about like early marriage, migration, again, same sort of combination of those impacts. The girl in the middle picture, she is someone who is studying in a B.Ed college in Ajmer, Rajasthan. At least that's what she told me when I met her in 2018. So it's been a few years. She might have graduated. So she was talking about how she can now go to study only after filling water. So so what I'm trying to say here is when they spend disproportionately large amount of time filling water, that means that any economic growth that's possible is delayed, or they have to drop out of educational institutes. So much of this sort of gets lost in a larger conversation about climate change, of so many sort of vulnerable groups get left behind. The woman in the right picture, she's showing basically how to what level the water comes when there's a flood. And they talk about, I asked them how do they manage sanitation, and she said, हम कपड़ा वहीं पे पानी में ही धो के फिर यूज करते हैं when they're on their period. And I think it's important, to talk about these things, because we're talking about then vaginal infections, again, public health impact. So a lot of sort of impact on women, I felt, was more in sort of the public health aspect, which a purely climate lens does not capture. So the research gaps for me as a journalist, when I'm looking towards the scientific community, I felt that climate and gender, there is some broad research about how climate change affects gender in very abstract terms, but not in like specific terms. I didn't see a lot of research, India based research. Climate and caste, nothing on that. But and I the reason I want to bring this up is because, again, in Bhadrakoni, I went to 3 different villages, and the access of water, the hand pumps, was different in different village. So the villages where caste people who were higher up on the caste hierarchy lived had more hand pumps, or their hand pumps were at a place where even if there was floods, the hand pump doesn't sort of go underwater. While in the communities that were lower down the caste hierarchy were living in vulnerable sections of the village, which was more prone to flooding. They were, or the if it's an entire village, if it was demarcated on caste lines, the number of hand pumps were limited, and location of hand pumps were different. So I thought that that's something that doesn't really get captured in a lot of the research. So now, how do you tell climate stories better? First, I think there's a need for journalists and researchers to collaborate as much as possible, to talk to each other, flag off story ideas. Now, I do want to acknowledge that science journalism in India is a very evolving space. We're still very nascent. We aren't where probably US is in terms of its science communication. We have very few science journalists in India. We obviously work under limited resources, and I think there's a lot of evolution that needs to happen on the journalism side. um, I have found and we know now, because we get data about who reads how much, especially in digital media, we have clear data on which stories get read more. For instance, there is a substantial reader interest in climate stories, so people care, people want to know. And I think it's important for us to understand that we can capitalize on it, or there is a hunger for that kind of news. Younger people are what we have to thank. They are driving the conversation. They're driving the climate protest. They're more worried about their future. There's a lot of climate anxiety among the younger people because it's their future at stake. And I think for me as a journalist, the challenging is, how do I tell these stories in a way that it's not doom and gloom all the time? Because people don't just want you to tell them that okay, climate change is happening. They know that. They want to know how can we help. So I get a lot of emails where people say, how what can we do, how can we help? And often I don't have the answers, but people want to kind of engage. So I want to go a little bit in detail about the youth movement. So the first one picture is from a climate strike in New York, where in 2019, during the General Assembly, there was Greta Thunberg was leading this climate strike, and Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of the UN, dedicated an entire day to conversation on climate change. So you saw a lot of young kids coming out, their parents coming out, and being a part of this movement. But you also saw very little of action, or very little action really, in terms of change in policy. That hasn't happened. But I would say a lot of conversations also that we're having about climate change is driven a lot by the reader interest also of the younger people. Um, the middle picture is from this last year's Glasgow UN climate conference. And there was a lot of push from indigenous communities to be included, from African negotiators are amazing. Bangladeshi negotiators are so amazing when they come to these conferences, and they are really talking about climate justice. They push for change in there. So there's a lot of like global push for equity and the need to recognize the disproportionate impact of climate change in developing countries. So broadly, here's what I think, that the youth, they care a lot about climate change. They're passionate about the cause. They are the ones pushing the government. They want to know more. They want to engage more, and they're being heard. Right? The media hears them. UN hears them. And they're actually the only cohort in the civil society who's treating climate change like the crisis that it is. Everybody else, like, you if you talk to, I mean, there is a front that the policymakers and even the UN officials will put in front of the media, that oh yes, we care. But in their private conversations, they might say, okay, yeah, like, we this is what we need to say now to placate the people, but we don't necessarily like want to really act. So there is, and that's because there is actually a gap in understanding. They genuinely think that there isn't a lot of change that's happening. While the young people, from my understanding, the young people, their description of climate might be weak for sure. If you ask them how to explain these things, that might be weak, but they really understand that there is a lot of impact that's happening, and we're running out of time, which is something that hasn't gone across to like the older generation of leaders. So barriers in science communication, and I'm speaking this about this in the Indian context and in a developing country context. So abroad in US or in Europe, most of the universities have press teams. So let's say I want to quote some researcher from Harvard. I can write to the Harvard press team, and they will direct me to the appropriate person. In India, that hasn't yet happened as much, so it's very I will have to individually reach out to a journalist, sorry, a researcher. I will have to do a lot of effort in trying to find the person. It might so act it's not very seamless. So I think that if universities can make that seamless, that would also help to some extent in climate communication. um, I have noticed a lot of times that if a scientist is working in a government organization, they can have multiple levels of permissions that they might need to seek. This is especially true if I want to talk to somebody who's not very senior. Women researchers, I have noticed, are often denied permissions to speak. Again, it holds true of women who aren't, maybe if they're heads of their department or something, then it's fine. But otherwise, I have had instances in one of the IITs where a senior male researcher wouldn't let me talk to. I wanted to also talk to the women researchers, just basically because I wanted diverse voices, and I like to speak to people across the age spectrum. But I was not given permission. I was denied permission. I would also say that, of course, on the journalism side, we are also, because we are evolving, and also because not all journalists might be acting very ethical. So I think many researchers have had bad experiences with journalists, which then makes them hesitant to speak to journalists. Um, so this is an experiment that a science journalist in US, his name is Ed Yong. He's a journalist from the Atlantic. What he did was he tied up with a researcher from MIT, and he got the researcher to write a code to sift through all the articles that Ed Yong had written over the past 2 3 years, and look at how many women are quoted in the stories, and whether they're coming higher up in the research or lower down, higher up in the news article or lower down, and whether they're there at all. So he found that in one third of his stories there were no women sources at all that he had quoted. And that's an article that actually got me thinking about sourcing and who I talk to. in my stories as well. So initially, I struggled with getting the gender balance right, and now sometimes I have a situation where I end up quoting multiple women, and then I realize that I haven't quoted men at all, and then I have to go back and try to find more men to talk to. So that's where I have reached now after 2 3 years of like intentionally doing it. But broadly, I'm not just about women, but I think it's important to include queer voices. It's just you get different perspectives from different people, and the way they look at the world is very different. There are things that women highlight that men don't, and vice versa. So it's just generally it's a good practice, I think. um and the one thing that I would just as a journalist I want to flag off is that I think there are some institutional barriers that women face in getting quoted, even if the journalists want to talk to more women. Now, how do you collaborate with journalists, right? So this is something where we're at a very initial stage here. um, Simple things that can go to some extent, but again, like I said, we don't have as many science journalists in India. So we're both working, both as in the scientific community and the journalism community will have to be patient with each other here. um, from what I could say as a journalist to all of you is you'd have to simplify the science, give examples. Think of, if you're talking to a journalist, think of it as explaining something to your grandmother. You have to really simplify it that way, because I am writing for a lay audience. I am not writing for a scientific audience. So I actually don't need very, very granular details. What I really need is for you to tell me what does this mean for a day-to-day life of somebody living in Mumbai, for instance, or like translate what does that mean. So that's something that might take some effort. And of course, as journalists also, it takes us a long time to really simplify things, and so I understand that some nuance will be lost and all of that, but I think it just helps to understand broadly that I'm writing for a general audience, and your general audience just needs to know कि अरे यार हमको क्या फर्क पड़ता है और हमको क्यों इसके बारे में फिक्र करनी चाहिए, ये बता दो हमको, ठीक है. So that is how people, and once you can tell them that, people really care about their children's health, people really care about their elderly's health, right? So if you can talk about why indoor air pollution is bad for all the people who are left behind in the house, they care. They People are moving out of Delhi for their children because now they care about what air pollution does to the lungs of little children. So yeah, so we have to find a way to kind of simplify the science. I would really say recommend each other's work to journalists. uh, and when I say recommend each other's work, I mean as researchers, if I call one of you can say, hey, you know what, thank you for talking to me. Also, for next story, you can think of XYZ. You should ideally also recommend other women researchers, or when you're recommending people, think of diversity. I would, especially if there are women researchers here who are listening to me, please recommend each other, because men don't recommend you, and you have to have each other's back at the very least. So that is something that women can do for each other. And I speak to a lot of women scientists who I go to regularly, and I'll tell them, this is the story I'm working on. Can you tell me of specific women scientists in India that I can reach out to? And they are like amazing about it. So that, and those are some ways that you can build solidarity within your group. Also, if you're a senior person, recommend a younger person as well. And amplify each other's work, so that would really help the ecosystem. And then explain broadly how your research fits in the larger conversation of climate change. Why should somebody who's older care? Like, why should they care? If you can explain that to them, that's great. So this is my two wish list kind of stories, collaborations that New York Times has done. So in the left story, an entire team of scientists and two journalists collaborated on the exact path climate migrants will take from South America in different climate scenarios. Okay, so they actually use like real climate projections of where temperatures will change, where agriculture production will go down, and what is the likely route that the migrants will sort of take. And they actually also, the journalists traveled with a migrant to to tell this prospective story. And that kind of like accurate scientific collaboration mixed with human interest stories, that's something that can really make like climate journalism come alive. On the right side is also another New York Times story, and I understand that New York Times has a lot of resources also to tell these stories, but this is just like my wish list or something we can attempt. This particular story, Who Gets to Breathe Clean Air in Delhi, what they did was they followed one kid who lived in a slum and one kid who lived in an upwardly mobile neighborhood in Delhi, and calculated how much pollution each of the kid breathes in throughout the day. And again, this was done very scientifically. An entire team of researchers worked to accurately calculate all of this. Journalists followed these kids through different neighborhoods in the day. And then they had a number in the end, like how much this kid X, what kind of pollution that kid managed to breathe in and versus the other kid. And I thought that that made for very compelling story. So here are some of the common complaints and prospective solutions that I hear generally when I'm also talking to scientists. So they say I've been misquoted, which is true. A lot of, and especially as science is hard to quote right, so if you worry about being misquoted, instead of not talking to a journalist, if you prefer email, try email. I prefer talking on the phone or video simply because it allows me to ask counter questions, and I might like be able to later on understand the science and use my own words to translate it. But if you're worried about like getting misquoted, try email. If somebody uses your off the record remarks, that's not cool on the part of the journalist. A journalist is not supposed to use your off the record remark, and it's unethical. You could complain to the organization or the editor, or use Twitter to clarify your stand. There are sometimes researchers say that you quoted two people, my name was not on top, the other person's name was on top, and I have no face to show in my community. Sorry, that's not how journalism works. um, some people will say I am the primary author, you can only interview me. That also doesn't work. Okay. As a journalist, my job is to ideally interview as many people on the research as possible, or whoever is quicker to respond, more available. Because again, the idea is really to just explain to a lay audience, and most people can do a reasonably good job of it. So I don't necessarily need a particular person who's been part of that study to speak to me. It doesn't necessarily just have to be the primary author, but I think that there can be some of that. I know internationally, a lot of primary authors will make it a point to say, actually, I've been quoted a lot by the media. Only talk to this other author who's not received as much publicity, and that is something I would love to see more in the Indian community. You can ask for a quote to be fact checked. You can tell somebody, you know what, write to me wherever you're directly quoting me, run that quote by me. You can ask that. You cannot ask them to share the entire story. Okay, so also sometimes, as a reporter, I might write a story, but my headline might not be in my control because I also get edited. So there is also some element of lack of control, and I don't really control when the story will be published. That sort of thing will also happen. But these are some of the common things that I've sort of heard. And all of them are justified, not all of them, but some of them are definitely justified complaints. And on the journalism side also, there's a lot of stepping up that we have to do. Okay, so that's it from me. Thank you so much. I will stop sharing right now. And yeah, I would
All
be
right.
happy to
Thank you,
take any
Disha. Can you
questions.
hear me?
Yes, I can, sir.
So nice. I mean, I really enjoyed, and I think most of others also must have enjoyed. Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Have a great evening.